Hello, we're here to talk about the setting up of a medical examiner system from a trust perspective. Can you just clarify for me, Daisy, your role and a little bit about your background, please?
Yes, of course. I'm a senior medical examiner's officer in Sheffield. I am what they call a clinical medical examiner's officer. I have a biomedical science, pathology-based background, and I've been working on the Sheffield pilot for the last 10 years to try and establish the best way to set up a system.
Right, so over that time of 10 years, you've had some experience then of how to work out how the best fit is and give advice to other centres as well on how they may configure the system.
Certainly. I think it's important to remember that one size doesn't fit all.
Right.
When we look at setup, that we have to look at what you already have, what your local configuration is, and how we can best fit the system around the systems that you already have in place.
Right. So, from a trust perspective, I know that the non-statutory system needs to come in from April of next year, and that will probably evolve and mature as time goes on.
Correct.
As having responsibility for the setup, can you tell me, where do I start? How do I begin?
Okay, so from April 2019, the system will be non-statutory. So that gives us a really nice lead-in time to develop the system gradually. It isn't a big bang situation. We don't have to do all the deaths, all the cases at the outset. The first thing that you need to look at is how many deaths you have.
Right.
So whether that is at one trust or a combination of trusts or different hospitals within an area. It may be that you decide to look at all your deaths at once. It may be that you decide to have offices, satellite offices in other areas. So you need to look at how many deaths that you have.
So that's in the trust, just to confirm that that's not including community cases.
That's correct. For the first rollout period from April, right, the idea is to look at deaths in secondary care with the hope that the primary care cases will come later once the system is established.
Right, that's good. That set my mind at rest because I was thinking, how could I include those cases? But if I start at least with the ones that we've got some knowledge of and control.
Yeah.
Right. If I have an imbalance of how many cases I have on one site compared to another, how does that affect how I start?
It may be that you want to look at the location where the most deaths are.
Right.
To have a look at how you manage the larger population of deaths, or it may be that you want to look at one of the smaller satellite areas and build on those cases first. What we found was that it was easier to look at the place where the most deaths occur to be able to get a good mix of the type of cases that come in. What you need to look at is what you already have. So is there a bereavement service, a centralised bereavement service? Right. What that system already involves. Do they have bereavement officers who are admin? Are they more clerical? Or are they more of a clinical background? Look on what their process is and see where we can build the medical examiner system on there. Rather than try and reinvent a whole service, we need to try and build on the practice that you've already got.
Right, so this isn't starting afresh and a particular prescribed way of doing things. It can adapt.
Yes, there's a lot of flexibility within that setup that can go from the type of medical examiner's offices that you want, the location of the service, how the system is run. There are certain steps in the process that have to be done, and they have to be done in a certain order, but how we get to those steps can be done in lots of different ways. Sheffield isn't the only pilot site. There were lots of different pilot sites that were developed over the years of piloting the system, and each one was different. We looked at rural Powys, where there's no hospitals, and they're just community hospitals. We looked at large inner city hospitals, and we've looked at areas where there is perhaps a little bit of a mix, and there might be 2 hospitals across the city. What we all found was that the system is doable.
Right.
It is workable.
Okay.
No matter what the logistics are, what your population is, or where the deaths occur, there is a way to develop the system to build on what you already have in place. And that's why it's important to remember that not one system will fit everybody.
Right.
So we need to tailor make it to what you already have.
Okay, so let's just go into a little bit more detail then, because one of the things that struck me is that there's quite a time pressure to get the medical examiner's steps undertaken so that families can make their registration appointments and so on. So perhaps if you just explain to me what actually happens then. If somebody dies today on the ward, and we have a centralised bereavement service, can you just take me through the steps that need to happen?
Yes.
And how I can understand that.
Yeah. So the great thing is you've already got a centralised bereavement service, so we can use them to help coordinate retrieval of the notes from the ward.
Right.
They can identify a suitable doctor to write the certificate. Right. And I'm sure that's something that your bereavement staff already do. Once they have those notes, the steps of the medical examiner's review then need to happen. And there are 3 distinct steps. One step is that the notes have to be reviewed by the independent medical examiner.
Yes.
And that has to be done independently of the doctor writing the certificate.
Yes. Okay.
It can either be done before the doctor has proposed a cause of death, or it can be done after the doctor has proposed a cause of death.
I see.
But when the medical examiner reviews the notes, they have to do it independently of the doctor's thoughts. So what we can't have is the doctor ringing up the medical examiner to ask, can I talk to you about this case? And then the medical examiner review the notes afterwards.
Okay.
Because that in a way is leading the witness.
Right.
You're directing the medical examiner into the area that you want to take them, rather than them independently reviewing the case on its own merits.
Right.
Once the attending doctor and the medical examiner have come to their own conclusions about a cause of death, there needs to be a discussion. That can either be done by the medical examiner or by a delegated officer.
Okay.
The discussion will focus around what they feel the cause of death is, do the team have any concerns, and whether or not they feel the case needs to be reported to the coroner.
Right.
If everybody is satisfied that a certificate can be issued, the doctor will write the certificate with the bereavement office in the same way that they do now.
Okay, yes, got that.
The bereavement officers will facilitate the writing of the certificate, the writing of the cremation form, and any additional documentation that is needed.
Right.
Once the certificate is written, a copy needs to be transmitted to the medical examiner's office, and that can be done via fax, it can be a photocopy, it can be a scan. There are lots of different ways of doing it. Once the office is in receipt of that certificate, what then has to happen is the third part of the scrutiny, which is the discussion with the bereaved.
Right.
That's an independent phone call, either from the medical examiner or their delegated officer, to explain to the family the cause of death that's been suggested, and to make sure that there aren't any concerns from their side that we may not be aware of. Sometimes things don't come across in the medical records. Sometimes the attending doctor isn't aware of issues that the family may have relating to pre-hospital care. All of those steps are done within 24 to 36 hours of the death being notified to the office.
Right.
And that's an important part to remember. It isn't from the death, because if the death happens at 8 o'clock in the evening, then by 8 o'clock the following morning, when the medical examiner's office is open, we're already 12 hours into the time. So it starts from when the medical examiner's office are notified of the case. It is achievable. It is something that we have managed to do for all our cases when we are properly staffed and resourced. We can do cases much quicker as well. There is sometimes the need to push cases to the front of the queue, and that can be facilitated as well.
Right. Now, something that the bereavement services officers tell me is that doctors are reluctant to come down. They have great difficulty in persuading doctors to come down in a timely manner.
Yeah.
Is that something that how do we overcome that?
It was something that we found as well when we first started piloting. The doctors that usually come to do the certificate are the junior doctors, and they may feel a little reluctant because they're unsure. They don't know the patient well enough, they haven't been able to speak to their consultant or registrar, or they're just a little bit unsure as to what they need to do. Sometimes there's a fear element, especially if a case needs reporting to the coroner, that they feel that they've done something wrong and that they're going to be judged. So commonly they put it to the end of their list. They will defer it until the end of the day. What we found in Sheffield and the other pilot sites were that before the medical examiner system, doctors would come down and sit for hours with the notes. They would ask the bereavement office, can I write this on a certificate? Do you think I'm okay to call this pneumonia? Or they'd ring the coroner's office and ask the same questions. And as experienced as the coroner's office and bereavement staff are with helping with completion of certificates, they're perhaps not the best people to ask for that clinical advice about doing the certificate.
Unless, of course, they've got clinical experience.
Of course,
yes.
Of course. Once the medical examiner system had become established, what we discovered was that doctors were much happier to come down to the office to do the certificate, because they knew there was somebody there to have that discussion with. They knew that somebody else had looked at the notes and that they were going to get that advice about formulating that cause of death to include the whole clinical picture.
Okay, so, well, that's very helpful from a process perspective. I suppose now I want to get into a little bit of detail about working out on my checklist, how many medical examiners do I need?
So the first thing to do is look at how many deaths that you have.
Is there an equation then, a formula?
The equation that we've been using is for a trust that covers 3,000 deaths per year.
Right.
You would be looking at 10 PAs of medical examiner time.
Okay.
So that's one medical examiner per day.
Right, I see, yes.
And to support that would be approximately 3 medical examiners' offices.
Right. So let's just deal with the medical examiners to start with. 10 PAs sounds like quite a lot. How many would that be? Would that be one whole-time equivalent, one doctor, or 3 doctors, or 5 doctors? What do you recommend?
It can be as many as you want. The important thing to remember is that there needs to be continuity for annual leave, sickness and cover. So one whole-time medical examiner, you would have the problems of when that medical examiner is on holiday, who then steps in to cover. If you have too many medical examiners, then there is the risk that they don't have that continuity of reviewing the cases. So one medical examiner per day, it may be that you have 5 medical examiners, one to cover each day of the week.
I see, yes.
And you have some additional hours on the Monday, which are usually the busiest days, post-weekend, where you can have that additional medical examiner time.
So additional capacity on the Monday, all bank holidays presumably, similar kinds of things.
Yeah.
Right. So I can get the idea of a rota for that. What about out of hours and weekends and bank holidays? Do we need to cover those?
That would really depend on the needs of the users of the service.
Right.
If you have a need for a weekend service, so if you have a community group that requires urgent release, so a strong faith community that require that urgent release, or a paediatric centre where families may wish to take home children who've passed away at the weekend, you may want to look at having some additional on-call cover over the weekend. What we've found is that a death that occurs at 2 o'clock in the morning can usually wait until 8 o'clock the following day.
Yes.
The burial can't take place, the death cannot be registered, and usually the doctors who have attended that patient in life, the actual team looking after that patient, aren't in the hospital. It's the on-call or the evening doctors.
Is there a way of preparing for that if there's something expected?
Certainly, if you have a patient who is expected to pass away, somebody who has been palliated and the death is felt to be natural, then preemptive scrutiny can be put in place. The attending team can contact the medical examiner's office and discuss the case with either the medical examiner's officer, if delegated to do so, or with the medical examiner. And a plan can be put in place about what the structure of the cause of death would be for the certificate, so that it can be written and given to the family out of hours. It still depends on the attending doctor having seen the patient in life, but again, that can be built into the plan as well.
Right.
If there's an evening doctor on call, they can go and see the patient and make provision for writing that certificate.
Yes. For still sticking with medical examiners, should I be targeting any particular specialty?
No, not at all. It's important to get the right person rather than somebody with the right background.
Yep.
Medical examiners need to be qualified doctors with 5 years post-registration, but they can be from any speciality. They can be pathologists, they can be surgeons, they can be acute medicine physicians. What we've found is having a good mix is really, really helpful, because it allows our medical examiners to bounce questions off each other. So we may have a general surgeon who is looking at a respiratory case and they're not quite sure about some element of it and they want to talk it through with somebody. So they ask a respiratory medical examiner, what do you think of this? Am I going along the right lines? And it works really well because we then have that peer discussion and that case review. So they all work, they have that opportunity to work together.
Right. Two things that spring to mind are, how long does it take? So how long would a medical examiner need for a case to review it correctly, approximately? Starting
off, the time for review will be a little longer. We have to remember that people are training, they're finding their feet. But once the system is set up and running, it's approximately 15 minutes per case.
15 minutes, I see.
Sounds short, but the case that's reviewed, it isn't a forensic examination of the records. The idea is to establish 3 things during scrutiny. What did somebody die from? Is there any need to report the case to the coroner? And are there any elements of care that would require raising to clinical governance, structured judgment review, learning from deaths? The medical examiners will review that case and the care, and it isn't a detailed forensic examination, it's a pragmatic view of the records in front of them. It may be that they request further information because there are questions that they have, things that don't seem to fit correctly, but on average it will be about 15 minutes per case.
Right, okay. You've answered my second question, which is whether or not one would need to start a bit slower and it might take longer at the start. Let's turn to officers now. I'm aware that there are different ways of configuring a medical examiner officer service.
Yes.
Emphasis on officers. Is this something that bereavement services officers can and should do? Because I can think that they would say that they do many of those components, talking with doctors and so on. So can you just walk me through that aspect of things?
Certainly. It's something that, again, we would advise build on what you already have. Some trusts have purely administration bereavement officers.
Yeah.
And they may require a little additional support from the medical examiner's officer. That may be a clinical officer, it may be a non-clinical medical examiner's officer. Where trusts have bereavement officers who have that clinical background or have got a lot of experience and knowledge because they've been doing that role for a long time, it may be that they require a little bit of admin support from a non-clinical medical examiner's officer.
Right.
It may be that you bookend the service. If you have a mixture of bereavement officers, you might want some additional admin support and some additional clinical support from the medical examiner's officers. But it might also be that there's a hybrid role. The bereavement officers can perhaps do both tasks. It will depend on what your medical examiners want to delegate to the bereavement officers or the medical examiner's officers. And that is something that, again, will develop over time. The system will mature and develop, and it might be that the medical examiners decide to delegate some of those tasks to their officers.
So how many officers do I need?
It depends on what duties they're going to be asked to do. If the medical examiner is going to look at doing the case review, the discussion with the doctor and the discussion with the family, you will need less officers.
Yes.
If your medical examiners were going to do the review of the case, but then delegate the discussion with the attending doctor and the family to the medical examiner's officer, you would need more officers.
Right. I can see a complication, which is the cremation form system, because I understand the funding for this system will be, at least to a greater extent, generated from completion of the second part of the cremation forms, by medical examiners doing that.
True.
Now, in the cremation form system, the doctor has to speak to the attending doctor and to somebody else, which could be which if it's the family, surely I don't need the medical examiner officers to do this, or is there another way of doing that?
With everything, there's lots of different ways of doing it. You're correct. The funding will come from the recycling of the cremation forms in the non-statutory system.
Yes.
Once the system becomes statutory, the funding will come from another stream. The medical examiners need to do part 2, and you're right, they need to speak to the attending doctor and to somebody else. That somebody else doesn't have to be a family member, and more commonly it is nursing staff or another doctor who has been involved in the care.
True.
The conversation that's had with the attending doctor is slightly different than what is had from a medical examiner or medical examiner's officer perspective. It may be that you want to combine that conversation, and again, if that works with your setup, then that's something that can be done. Or it might be that because of the number of cases that you have, the officers have that first conversation with the attending doctor, but the second conversation is had by the medical examiner doing the cremation form.
Okay, but cremation form, it all has to be done by the same doctor, doesn't it? How does one get round from I could see a medical examiner being available on Monday, but the attending doctor's not available till later that day, and the time has passed for the conversation with the family member, say.
Yeah.
So that would then carry on into the next day, which might be a different medical examiner. That makes it complicated.
A different medical examiner can do the cremation form.
Right.
It doesn't have to be the same medical examiner who does the cremation form and the review of the records.
Isn't that duplicating then?
It's a good sense check to make sure that your medical examiners are getting it right. It provides that additional check. The only part of it that there is a duplication on is the discussion with the attending doctor.
Right.
And those conversations are usually very quick, they aren't complicated, and so to complete the cremation form, the phone call discussion of, I see you've written a certificate, did you have any concerns, is a relatively simple phone call to make. So although there may be a small area of overlap, it's actually a really good way to check that everything has been covered correctly in the first phase.
Right. So presumably I can see the value in when there's a large volume of cases that some of those tasks being undertaken by an officer can be more efficient
Yeah.
and use less medical examiner time, and gets around that obstacle. It's separating the cremation form from the medical examiner
Yes.
scrutiny then.
Yes.
Although it's okay for a medical examiner to have that conversation with the attending doctor
Of course.
and the family members.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
which is...
And it may be that you don't have to have one certain system. The system can be fluid in its approach.
Okay.
In that if you have medical examiners officers who usually do that task, but a medical examiner is in the office, they've reviewed a case and a doctor appears to discuss that case, the medical examiner can speak to the doctor directly. If they then have the time, they can then contact the family or contact another doctor or member of staff who's taking care of that patient and then sign the cremation form.
Yes.
Whilst they're there. It will very much depend on the throughput of work, how many cases you have, what works best for the setup for the team that you have, but that can vary from case to case.
Right, yes. I understand. One of the things that strikes me is how practically, starting from no medical examiners and no medical examiner officers, I get the idea of asking how many deaths we have and understanding the process of the centralised bereavement service and flow and this sort of thing. What other things do we need to think about in getting this working?
Accommodation
Right.
is a key point. You need your medical examiners to be able to be either co-located or next to or close to the bereavement service that already exists. It would be very difficult to have a bereavement services at one end of the hospital and the medical examiner's office at the other end of the hospital,
Yes, I can see that.
because transmission of notes and doctors would be difficult. So there needs to be a space for the medical examiner's team. That space needs to have the ability to be quiet when needed. The discussions with the doctors can sometimes be sensitive and confidential, and the discussions with the family that are had, you also need a quiet space to be able to do that, to give them that full attention without a lot of background activity and noise. So accommodation is a key point. IT support is another. Medical examiners and their officers will need access to trust computer systems if records are electronic, if you have the ICE pathology reporting system, a different way of scanning and recording records, they need to be able to access those. And most importantly, they need to access the records, whether they're electronic or paper.
Yes.
If the notes are paper, they also need to be able to access those as well.
Yes, right. So just thinking about how that links with the cremation system, the cremation form is usually, at least in our current system, is with the notes. So if we use a medical examiner model, medical examiner who may undertake the cremation form the next day would need access to the records, wouldn't they? Or is there another way of providing the information that they need?
There's a variety of ways. The notes could go with the cremation form, or it might be that the medical examiner who reviewed the case before provides their summary for the second medical examiner doing the cremation form. It has real advantage in if you're the doctor or the medical examiner doing the second part, to see what your colleagues' thoughts were, to see the discussion that's been had by the attending doctor and the discussion with the family before you sign off on that cremation form.
Yes.
It can give you that valuable information that you need to be able to sign off the cremation form.
Presumably then avoids the need to duplicate lots of rummaging around medical records, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it may be that there's a small duplication of the phone call to the attending doctor, but actually we save a lot of time in the review of the records.
So the cremation form actually becomes quite a short component of the medical examiner review
Yes,
that way,
yeah.
in that system. So it can be achieved, can't it?
It can, and
Yes.
and if you think about how it currently works in the community at the moment, somebody who passes away in a care home, When the GP completing the first part of the cremation form sends that to the second part, they don't send that with the full patient's medical records.
No, that's true. But hospitals are a bit different, aren't they? They do have more things happen and there's more information in them.
They do. And sometimes it may be that a quick dip into the notes is needed. But for some cases, it may be that that component of the cremation form can be reduced.
I suppose medical examiners need to have confidence with one another, don't they?
Of course, and their officers.
Yeah.
They need to work together as a team, and that's why we say you need to get the right people in post for both the officers and the medical examiners.
Okay. Officers to be an admin MEO, what sort of level am I needing to think of for that kind of grade?
At the moment it is looking at a band 4 or possibly a band 5.
Right.
And for clinical medical examiners officers it would be increased to a band 6.
Okay, so that's because
of the professional registration and the degree level knowledge that would be needed.
Just to be clear, the clinical MEO role, which includes interaction with the doctors and interactions with the families, at the level of explaining and discussing causes of death, needs to have clinical knowledge and background at a level of a junior ward sister equivalent.
So somebody who has got that clinical experience and can discuss not just the causes of death with the family, but also if they ask questions about what things mean or if things are related, certain pathologies are related to each other or are related to events that have happened, they need to be able to have that clinical knowledge to be able to explain and talk through the family with that.
Understand. And for the admin role, which could include an interaction with attending doctors and with family members like bereavement services officers do, it stops short of that detailed discussion, clinical discussion.
Yes, and it may be that you delegate those conversations to the bereavement staff, and if the case is straightforward and the family have no concerns and no questions, then that is a sufficient conversation.
Okay.
They've been asked the question, do they have any concerns? If the answer is no, then that's acceptable. If the answer is yes, we do, and we don't understand this cause of death, we want to talk to somebody about it, then that might be where they're signposted off to the clinical MEO or the medical examiner, depending on what you have in your setup.
What you're saying. But just also to be clear, the medical examiner officer role is a distinct entity, as opposed to being, I can't call my bereavement services officers, our bereavement service officers, become medical examiner officers overnight?
No, it is a distinct role. It may be that there's a hybrid role, so you can have bereavement officers who have a dual function, but they won't all become medical examiners officers overnight.
And a medical examiner, would it be a case of switching hats for different components?
Yes.
So that there is a clear clarity. I could foresee a concern about independence in that.
Yes.
Potentially.
It may be that you have bereavement officers who would like to progress on to become medical examiners officers. It may be that they are all interested and they would like to do a dual role. So they have a couple of hours a day that is medical examiner officer time and a couple of hours a day that is bereavement service time. The possibility of a hybrid role is still being discussed at the moment. It may be that having a separate medical examiner's officer role is the way that most trusts go. It may be that they look at a combined role, but again there isn't a definite right or wrong. It's about developing what you already have and looking at the staff that you've got in place.
Okay, so do you think I need a project manager?
Yes, certainly. At the outset, you need somebody who can drive this forward. You need somebody to take responsibility for obtaining accommodation, making sure that the job adverts, the right people are appointed, and also to change manage as well. Although we're saying we're not reinventing the wheel, we do appreciate that there is going to be some concern and some reservations from people already involved in the bereavement process. Our bereavement officers were certainly quite fearful of the system when we started. They felt we were going to take their role because they speak to doctors and they speak to families. They still have those roles, they still speak to doctors and speak to families, but the responsibility and pressure is taken off of them. They're not the ones having to decide, can the doctor write pneumonia, is that right or wrong? Or that concern that the family have, do I need to escalate it or not? They have somebody to pass that on to.
I understand. Right.
They also found that once that pressure had been removed, the doctors were more amenable to coming down, they could actually spend more time with the family and they could actually do their role as bereavement officers. And our bereavement staff actually said, we've been so busy doing everything else, we've not really been looking after the bereaved. And they're at the centre of this. This is why we're doing it, for the bereaved. And it is so important to make sure that we give the bereaved the resources that they need. And if they need to sit and have a chat with a bereavement officer, then that needs to be there, rather than the bereavement officer thinking, I have to get back because a doctor's coming down to discuss a cause of death. That side of it can be mopped up by the other staff as well.
Who are the other stakeholders that I need to involve in the setup of this?
The mortuary staff need to be made aware.
I suppose they need to know what's going on, yes.
Yeah, and usually the cremation forms are done in the mortuary as well.
Yes.
So there may be a cohort of Part 2 doctors who currently do cremation forms that will no longer be doing that role, and that needs to be handled sensitively. The coroner is a real key player in this, and we would suggest early on, have a meeting with your coroner, get them on board, find out how they work, how their system works, and what they hope to achieve from the system as well. And likewise with the coroner's offices play a real pivotal part in certificates and referrals, and we need to make sure that we're not going to have a detrimental effect on the work and the process that they do.
Understood. Anybody else?
The Trust Learning from Deaths and Clinical Governance teams,
we've got to integrate that.
Yes.
And we can use the medical examiner system to notify for those. What about outside? What about registration services? Do they need to be involved in this?
In the community or out of hospital side of things, it's the registration services and the funeral directors as well. The registration services, they are ultimately the ones who have to register the certificates. So we have to make sure that the medical examiners are giving the correct advice to doctors about writing certificates. Yes. We have to make sure and reassure them that we're not going to disrupt their 5-day registration rule.
Yes.
Deaths have to be registered within the 5 days of them occurring. So we have to make sure that we can meet with that time scale. And we have to make sure that we have a good relationship with them, so that if there are any problems, that they can feed back rather than send the family away and come back to us later.
How do I collect the data? Where do I put it, the information?
At the moment, the Department of Health and Social Care are looking at creating a digital platform to help facilitate the collection of data. We've been using a very simple access database that was developed in-house to be able to store that. It may be that you already have systems that can be used to store that data, so bereavement services database, the Datix database, or it may be that a simple Excel spreadsheet will be a good way to collect the data in the meantime. And that's something that the project manager will need to have a look at as well.
Are there forms?
There are forms, and those are the basis of the digital system. There are forms for the medical examiner and there are forms for the attending doctor, and they really lay out the data set that is collected within the process.
Right. Will this take a lot of time for them to fill those in?
No, not at all. the attending doctor really needs to fill in what they want to put as the cause of death, whether they've had a conversation with the coroner's office or medical examiner's office, and sign it. A majority of the information about the patient is already held in the records, so we wouldn't ask doctors to rewrite patient demographics because it's already there. The medical examiner form, again, it's a very short form. It's a summary of their thoughts, what the proposed cause of death is, any discussions with the doctor and the discussions with the family. Those forms will become the basis of the digital system that is hoped to roll out to coincide with this in April 2019. They are in the process of having the database built, and the idea will be, once we're in the non-statutory phase, to start testing that platform.
So that will be available to you?
It will, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
One thing that occurred to me through this conversation is, where does the consultant in charge of the case fit in? If the junior doctors are being is the medical examiners trumping, if you like, the consultant's view, or the junior doctor telling them what to write, that sort of thing?
Not at all. We'd never bypass the consultant's opinion, and we actively encourage the attending doctor to discuss the case with the consultant first. It is so important to make sure that we have got the clinician responsible for the patient's view before we do a certificate.
Yeah.
We always explain to our doctors, they're the ones who've looked after the patient, not the medical examiner. So if there is a difference of opinion as to whether it's a pneumonia or a heart failure as the terminal event, the doctor's looking after the patient, providing there is evidence for it, we will always go with their opinion. We do have some consultants who will suggest slightly incorrectly structured causes of deaths that we just need to reverse the sequence, or we need to include certain elements that have not been recognised. But we'll do that through discussion with the consultant. We'll sometimes get consultants that will say cases don't need reporting to the coroner. But if those cases clearly do need reporting to the coroner, we will ensure that they get reported. If the junior doctor feels a little stuck in the middle because their consultant has said it doesn't need reporting and the medical examiner has said it does, for say a surgical procedure for example, then we will offer to report it for them on their behalf so that they don't feel conflicted.
Right.
And we will also notify their consultant as well.
So the doctors do the reporting to the coroner?
Yes, the doctors still do the reporting to the coroner, and the doctors still write the certificate. There may be the possibility to adapt the role of the medical examiner's officer, where if the same data set is collected for the medical examiner and a synopsis of the case is documented, that they use that same information to send it off to the coroner.
So it could actually save time then, couldn't
yes,
it?
yeah.
Okay, I get that. Right. So I understand that I need some medical examiners and I need some medical examiner officers.
Yeah.
I know that the training is online for the e-learning and there's face-to-face training. Is that enough, or can they just start on day one doing the work?
It is a gradual process. It isn't something that the appointed medical examiners will just slot straight into doing. What we would suggest is start small.
Right.
Don't try and do all the cases at once. You need to make sure that you're doing it right for a small amount of cases first. So start with a few cases, maybe 2 or 3 a day. Get the medical examiners to review them. Make sure that your quality indicators are coming back positive. So are we getting certificates rejected by the registry office? Are the coroners raising concerns that certain cases are being reported or not reported? Are doctors coming up with completely different causes of death to what your medical examiner has suggested? If everything seems to be going well, then extend it and do some more cases.
Right.
But rather than try and do all of them at once and mistakes be made and things fall down along the way, unfortunately what will happen is people will lose faith in the system. And it only takes once to give duff advice that the system, then people become sceptical of how the system will work and the advice.
So is there a role for some local training then as well?
Yes, yeah. So again, it goes back to looking at getting your coroner and your registration services on board early on. They have got an awful lot of experience into what cases want reporting, what phrases and causes of death are acceptable. And also the bereavement office as well, that they've got a good overview of death certification as a whole.
So a training day, a sort of half day, something like that?
Yeah. So
bespoke.
A local training package of a session with the coroner, registration services and the bereavement services will help your medical examiners not just understand the role of scrutiny and what they're looking for, but the impact that their work will have on the stakeholders as well, and why it's so important to get it right.
Going through cases?
Yes.
Is that one of the best ways to do that?
That's one of the best ways,
right.
yeah.
Okay.
There's no better way to learn than to actually do. And having a group of medical examiners, again, you can build on that peer review and training. So it may be that you have a couple of cases that 2 medical examiners do, and they talk about the case afterwards. They bounce ideas off of each other. What did you think? Did you see that there was a delay in giving the antibiotics? And that's a really good way of learning from each other as you go through.
Right. Okay. I've got that, the training, that sort of thing. You mentioned quality indicators. I understand that those are the measures. One thing that I'm still trying to get my head round is how I go about appointing everyone. Should I appoint everybody all at once, or is there a different approach that you would recommend? All medical examiners, all medical examiner officers?
I think, as we mentioned, a project manager to start with to facilitate things, and then look at appointing a lead medical examiner and a lead medical examiner's officer.
Right.
Get those people in place first. Make sure that they know what they're doing and what's asked of them. It's important to include your coroner and the trust as well in the appointment of your medical examiners. It may be that the coroner has had good experience with some consultants within the trust who have given good evidence at an inquest, that they respect and trust their opinion and may be very good as a medical examiner. Once you have your lead medical examiner and officer in place and they have had chance to have that local training, do a bit of face-to-face training, you can then look at recruiting additional officers, additional medical examiners, and you then have the resource to train those people as well. If you appoint everybody at once, it may be a little blind leading the blind, because everybody will be coming at it from a slightly different perspective.
I can see there'd be value in testing, trying it one way and then seeing if it works and being prepared to change.
Yes.
Do you agree?
Yes. Just because you decide to set up a process or a system in one way to start with, as the system becomes embedded, it may be that things change along the way, and the process is flexible to allow for that.
How long do you think it would take for everything to get up to speed?
For the appointment, training, and for people to have a good understanding of what they're doing,
yes.
About 3 months.
Right. 3 months in total.
Yeah. It depends on how many...
Presumably increases as time goes on.
Yeah.
I understand.
It depends how often your medical examiners are doing cases. If they're only coming down for 1 day a week,
yeah.
It may take slightly longer. If they're coming down for 3 days a week, it will take slightly shorter.
I suppose everybody starts from a different baseline of knowledge too.
Exactly.
Of their own experiences of this.
Yeah. But
yeah.
So the 3 months is to get everybody on board. The bereavement office, the coroner's office. Yeah. Rather than just the medical examiners up to speed with training.
What you mean now, yes. Okay. So, for a trust with the 3,000 deaths, that's 10 PAs of medical
Yeah.
examiner time, plus how many officers would that need?
Between 3 and 4 officers, depending
on their experience and levels as
Yes.
you described.
Yeah,
If I've got a trust with 1,200 deaths a year, what should I be looking at?
just multiply it up.
Okay, so what I'd need three PAs of medical examiner time.
Yeah, so you would need more medical examiners to do the cases. If you have one medical examiner to do 10 cases in a day and you have 30 cases in a day, you would need additional medical examiner
Yes,
time.
okay.
It may be that if your number of cases goes up, you delegate more to the medical examiner's officers. So you will need slightly less medical examiner time and slightly more officer time.
Yes, but it's not necessarily a totally linear relationship,
No.
is it?
No.
It's according to how many deaths you have, what sites they occur, where
Yes.
they occur,
Yeah.
when they occur,
Yeah.
and there needs to be coverage of an office.
Yes.
Nevertheless, doesn't there?
Yeah.
I suppose because doctors can come at different times.
So the 12,000 deaths,
1,200.
sorry, 1,200, 12,000 be a lot, 1,200 deaths per trust. If they were all in one site, then you may need less medical examiners. If they were in 4 different sites, 4 different hospitals within a city, then it may be that you need slightly more medical examiners because they have to be in those locations.
Yes. Or is there a scope? Do you think where because there's a satellite unit that has maybe 1 death a day? I don't want to have a medical examiner going across to that unit.
No.
Is there a way around that?
It may be that the notes can come to the medical examiner. Powys trialled a scanning system of getting the notes across.
Electronic ones or shared records,
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
So the medical examiner doesn't have to be
Yeah.
where the cases are. So if you have one main hospital
Yes.
where you have 5 deaths a day and 3 satellite hospitals or locations where there's 1 death a day, you wouldn't need 4 medical examiners.
Right.
You wouldn't need a medical examiner in each location because it would be uneconomical. What you might have is a central hub at the location where the majority of deaths occur, and the deaths from the satellite areas can feed into there. And it may be that the medical examiner goes past that hospital on the way home and calls in, or another medical examiner lives nearby or has a clinic over there on that day. And okay, it might not be their day to be a medical examiner, but they can call into the bereavement
Potentially
office
do
and
the cremation form, presumably.
Yes.
'Cause
Yeah.
That's the other obvious tricky bit.
yes,
Okay, so I've got clarity. So in summary, I need to appoint a project manager, work out
Yeah.
how many deaths I've got, where they occur,
yeah,
use that template broadly to work out how many medical examiners I need
Yeah.
and how much time they need to devote to it. Similarly with officers, a combination of admin or clinical or both or however
Yeah.
we work it. Cremation form system can happen separate, but doesn't have to by any means. It can
Yeah.
all be bundled together
yeah,
according to what works well. Test it small and
Yeah.
slowly and build up,
yes,
ensuring that I have engaged the coroner and the registration services.
yes.
Have I forgotten anything?
Don't think so.
Thank you very much. That's been
quite
really
all
helpful.
right. No problem.